Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Algonquin College Speaker Series, special location tonight, Festival Hall, because we're going to show you a movie, which is a little bit of an add-on. I know we have never done this in the history of the Speaker Series, but given the story that we're about to tell tonight and the opportunity to show the movie, we thought that would be in the best interest to have it here at Festival Hall. I'm Jamie Bramberger. I'm the Manager of Community and Student Affairs at Algonquin College's Pembroke campus. In tonight's story, I think there are a few of you who know this story quite well, but I think you're going to learn a lot more about it tonight through the conversation we're going to have with Julian Sher, who is a very well-known and respected and award-winning journalist who worked many years for the Fifth Estate, the CBC, and it was really the Fifth Estate story about the Steven Truscott case that ultimately resulted in the Ontario government declaring it a miscarriage of justice. So we're going to dive into this tonight. We'll talk with Julian for about 45 minutes. Then we'll take a 5 or 10 minute break so you can have a washroom break, get a drink, maybe some popcorn. There's a night at the movies as well. And then we'll go into the movie. And then as the movie ends, Julian will be outside in the lobby area, and he has copies of his book about the Steven Truscott case. Normally $30+ in tax, and he's selling them tonight for $20. So if you want to take one away with you, a signed copy of the author, you'll have that opportunity. So please welcome Julian Sher. All right, I just have to do a quick technical check. Cameras rolling, are we good? Yes? Okay. Julian, great to have you in Pembroke, welcome.
Good to be here. Thank you all for coming out on that cold night. It's colder here than in Montreal.
Just a few degrees perhaps, very close to everything. Let's go back to June 9th, 1959. This is on the Clinton Air Force Base in southwestern Ontario. Lynne Harper is 12 years old. She's a classmate to Steven Truscott, who was 14 at the time, and she goes missing. What's happening that night?
Well, just imagine, it's a hot summer day. A lot of you probably have people or know people from the Petawawa Army Base. You know what Army life is like. This is the Clinton Base. There's a school right on the base, really. Steven Truscott is a very popular, handsome 14-year-old. It's important, I think, to remember that this was a different time, but also in many ways a different country. Right? I mean, Stephen would have been watching, as I was, Steve McQueen, black and white, Wanted Dead or Alive, or Joe Friday with Dragnet. And I like to say that TV was black and white back then, but so was justice. Right? Everybody trusted the police, trusted the courts. It's a hot day, the kids are out playing in the schoolyard, some are down by the river fishing, looking for turtles, and Steven Truscott will take a fateful bicycle ride into history. He will give Lynne Harper a ride on his bike, and I've been to the base and nothing's changed. It looks exactly the same, the highway, the school. He gets on the bike and they ride down the country road. According to Stephen, crosses the bridge, waves to some people, drops her off at the highway. Comes back home, talks with kids, he's looking perfectly normal, and that night she goes missing, and terror spreads through the military base.
We're going to bring up a picture of Steven Truscott with that bike. This is taken around the time as they just bring it up. But 2 days later, Lynne Harper's body is found in a wooded area. It's a horrific crime. This is a 12-year-old girl, right? Sexual assault, strangled to death. And then you can imagine the uproar on that Air Force base. What happened? Who did it?
Her body is found. She goes missing Tuesday night. The police come to the parents' house. An interesting fact, which will never be revealed until I write about it in the book, is it's about 11 o'clock, and according to the police reports, they ask very worried parents, what do you think happened to your 12-year-old? And they say, well, she might have gone found hitchhiking to her grandmother's. So just keep that in mind, right? The police look everywhere, can't find her. 2 days later, they find her body in the woods. And it's important, if the school is here, the bridge and the highway is here, the woods are here, right? So Steven, of course, says he took her all the way down to the highway. The body was found in the woods, sexually assaulted, murdered. That evening, they arrest Steven Truscott. Now, if I was a police officer, Steven would have been high on my list of suspects because everybody knew he was the last person to see her. But why rush to arrest him? That's where the beginning of his nightmare started.
And the interesting part about this is 14 years old, pretty inexperienced in life.
That's right.
And after this crime occurs, he goes back home just like any normal teenager, turns on the television and watches. There's no evidence on him of any struggle.
That's right. That's right. And keep in mind, when he gets picked up by the police on late Thursday, they don't notify his parents, right? They weren't required by law back then. So you've got this terrified 14-year-old who's being interrogated by police.
And you've got child witnesses. These are little kids, really.
That's right.
That are being interviewed about what did you see? Did you see Lynne and Steven on the bike? So you've got all these families that are in turmoil as these children are dealing with the death of a friend, and now the charging of another friend.
That's right. The lead investigator is Harold Graham, the rising OPP star of homicide. He will later go on to lead the OPP. So that evening, the police issue an all-points bulletin trying to look for a possible suspect before they've landed on Steven. And again, keep this in mind. That police bulletin, again, never shown to the jury, says, young girl killed, believed around 9 p.m. That's really important. So the police hear from the parents, she may have hitchhiked to grandma's, and then the police put out a bulletin Thursday looking for a suspect. Girl died around 9 p.m. And Steven, we know, was in bed and asleep at 9 p.m. That was never revealed to the jury.
We're going to bring up a picture here of Lynne Harper as a 12-year-old and Steven Truscott as a classmate. While we're doing that, and just going to move us along a little bit because we've got a movie to show, which is going to answer some more questions. 2-day preliminary hearing goes forward, 31 witnesses called, 21 pieces of evidence presented. The magistrate rules it will go to a trial. The trial happened. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say an adult trial. He's 14.
Yes.
He's bumped up to adult court, not juvie court. So now he's tried as an adult.
At a time when Canada still has the death penalty, which we'll get into a little bit more in just a moment. It goes to trial September 16th, 1959. What always strikes me when I look at these cases from that era is how quick things move through the court system. This happens in June, and by September, a 14-year-old is on trial for capital punishment murder of a 12-year-old girl. And the outcome of this is a conviction.
That's right. And the judge utters those famous words, Steven Truscott, you've been found guilty. I sentence you to hang until you are dead. Talk about speed. That trial took 14 days. Back then, we didn't have what we now know as discovery, right? Now, if you get charged for almost anything, quite rightly, the prosecution and the police have to turn over to your defense lawyer police reports, witness statements, medical reports, all the information they have, including information that the police discarded, maybe because it pointed to somebody else. None of that was obliged during the trial. So the two things I mentioned to you, the parents, at one point, one of her parents is put on the witness stand. Steven has said, yeah, I dropped her off at the highway because she wanted to hitchhike. The prosecutor asks the parent, does your daughter ever hitchhike? No, never. Even though the night of her disappearance, the first thing they said was she may have hitchhiked to grandma's. But the jurors never found that out. When the coroner gives his testimony, he will say, and this is, is such a key point, this is what sentenced Steven to the gallows, the coroner says, I looked at her stomach contents, and based on that, the murder took place between 7:15 and 7:45 p.m. Now, aside from the fact that science doesn't allow you to look at a jar and give a half-hour time of death, remember, what did the police first say? 9 p.m. And it just shows you how bad the investigation was.
And the precision around that half-hour window, it can only be Steven Truscott if
That's right.
that's what you nail
As
it
I
down
point out
to.
in the book, if Dr. Peniston, that was the name of the local coroner, if he's right, if based on science and stomach contents, she died between 7:15 and 7:45 on Tuesday night, absolutely Steven did it. There is no doubt about it, because she wasn't with anybody else until then. Here's the really spooky part. This goes down in history. He issues his autopsy report. It's published, it's presented to the jurors, and when he testifies, again, black and white TV, black and white justice, the jurors see this respected, well-liked local doctor. He says 7:15 to 7:45, that was the time of death. Well, because of our investigation for the book and for the Fifth Estate, because of discovery and access to information, we got hold of the police notebooks of the policeman who was there that night at the autopsy. And it's very detailed. And what do the police want that night, right? They want to know, how did she die? Knife, gun, and when. Anybody who watches any crime show, right? What's the time of death, right? Well, I go through the notes, and it says strangled, sexual assault. There's no time of death. He did not give a time of death that night. That's the one thing the police officer would have written down. He only gives it later, after they had arrested Steven Truscott, which to me suggests he was given the window by the police when they knew they had a suspect. He did not give that fateful time when he first does the autopsy.
Steven Truscott never testified at his first trial. We'll get into the Supreme Court of Canada, which comes later. And also, of course, there was a publication ban because he was a minor. Interestingly, compared to what would happen nowadays, even though this had widespread media coverage across the country, all the reporters went away.
That's right. You have this murder trial, which now is famous. Back then, it's grabbed some headlines. Publication ban, the journalists leave, and 2 weeks later, when he's found guilty, you'll see headlines, boy sentenced to hang, murder, that's it. Nobody does what we do now, commonplace. When there's a publication ban, journalists stay there, we take notes, we look at the testimony, and have you seen in any of your local papers, or the Star, or the Globe and Mail, or the Ottawa Citizen, after a trial is over and there's a publication ban, the journalists then say, here's what happened, here's what the jurors didn't hear, here's the testimony that didn't make sense. None of that happened until a very brave woman, Isabelle Laborde, in 1963, does what no journalist in Canada had done to that time, question what had happened at a trial.
The conviction comes in, the final arguments are made on September 29th, 1959. Everything goes to rest, and then the verdict comes in. The Crown Attorney, Glenn Hayes, really pushes that this is a clear-cut case.
Absolutely.
There's all kinds of evidence in his mind. The defense lawyer, Mr. Donnelly, is really, it doesn't feel like a fair game as he tries to build his case for his client.
Absolutely. He didn't have the witness statements. We talked about these dozens of children. We found witness statements that were withheld that would have clearly supported Steven's account. We found witness statements that the prosecution used as witnesses who said on the stand things that were different than they had said in sworn statements to the police. None of that was available. The police notebooks that I had access to, all that information. So it was a completely unfair trial.
I want to this is a little caption from your book that I made in my notes here, where defense lawyer Donnelly is challenging Judge Ferguson, challenging him over his charge to the jury, which is really the directions to the jury before the jury makes its findings. And this is in quotations, what he said that day. "And with the greatest respect, my lord, I submit that the jury listening to your charge could not help but get the impression that you consider a verdict of guilty was warranted on the evidence. It's really as close as he can come to saying to the judge that you've got a bias in this case. And Ferguson says, what's wrong with that?
Yeah, it was horrific. Remember I was telling you school, bush, bridge, and highway. Well, Donnelly has various young witnesses, and we track some of them later on as adults, who clearly say, totally credible, they say, yeah, I was looking for turtles at the bridge. I saw Steven and Lynne cross the bridge. We track down that boy to this day, Dougie Oates. He says, absolutely, I know what I saw. Well, the prosecution tried to say it was a conspiracy. Yeah, between like a 10-year-old and a 14-year-old, he's going to lie on the stand. But what was shocking is, so the jury has to say, okay, do we believe, these young boys who say they saw Steven, or do we believe the prosecution? The judge, in his charge to the jury, says the defense said he crossed the bridge and made it to the highway. He said, but somebody brought back her body back across the bridge. Truscott could have brought back, nobody ever alleged, nobody saw Truscott going back across the bridge. It was a total fabrication, and it was a very serious bad charge to the jury. The judge was completely biased.
Steven Truscott's story is that Lynne asked for a ride.
Right.
Give her a ride down to the highway on his bike. He does so. He says he sees a car.
That's right.
And that became
A key issue. He drops her off, waves goodbye, comes back to the bridge where all the kids are hanging out, and he says, I see a car, it had big fins, and he says, I saw a flash of yellow, right? Could have been a license plate. Now, in the trial, the prosecution distorts that statement and says, he saw the license plate. He never said he saw the license plate. And then they had policemen show photographs and say, there's no way you could see a license plate, you could barely see a car. Well, as you know, if you take a picture, how you take that picture will influence things. I stood at that bridge. It is not that far from the road. You would clearly be able to see the make of a car, the fenders. You'd be able to see the color of the plates or any sticker. So Steven wasn't lying, but the prosecution turned him into a liar.
This was a military base with a lot of young airmen that would have
Yep.
been at the Clinton Air Force Base. There could have been a lot of other suspects.
I've worked very closely with police. As you know, I've written books on the Hells Angels, so I have a tremendous amount of respect for dedicated, honest police. And I remember showing an early draft of my manuscript to a police friend because I said, I don't want to prejudge these, Harold Graham and the police at the time. Am I being too harsh on them? Or did they see it in a way that, and he said, no, this was a bad investigation. Think about it. Young girl, 12 years old, goes missing and then sexually assaulted within, yards of a military base where you have young men, transient men, who are also captive on the base and can escape. That's a pretty good witness pool and maybe a suspect pool. The police could have asked the military for records of anybody who'd been convicted or charged with certain things. They never questioned any of the military men. And as you know from the book and the documentary, we found through our own research a military man named Alexander Kalichuk who was found to have picked up young girls near the base, checks himself in to a mental institution for psychiatric work within days after the murder. He is never questioned, never investigated. We're not saying he's guilty. All we're saying is he and others were surely worth a look, but the police weren't interested. They were focused on Steven Truscott.
In the final analysis, and we'll bring up a picture of Steven in just a few moments. This is a mugshot. We don't know if it's the actual arrest picture. He looks a little bit older,
So
in
it
this
could be
photo.
when he goes to prison, federal prison, yeah.
But the jury returns a unanimous verdict of guilt. And he is sentenced by the presiding judge, as you said, to be hung as a capital crime. Justice Ferguson writes a 16-page report to Canada's Justice Minister at the time, David Fulton, in which he wrote, and this is in quotations, The jury rejected the defense and, in my view, had good reason to do so. He then went further to write, "I know of no reason other than the youth of the prisoner to recommend him for the Queen's mercy." Prime Minister John Diefenbaker is a lawyer, and he decides to commute the sentence to life imprisonment.
I dug in to the cabinet minutes because they were now available 20, 30 years after. And Diefenbaker and the cabinet are deciding what to do. And what's shocking, but perhaps predictable, is they decide to commute his death sentence to life in prison, not because they were appalled by the miscarriages of justice, not because they had any doubt, but the cabinet minutes show that they were worried about Canada's image in the world for hanging a 14-year-old. So if Steven had been 16 or 18, he'd be dead. Right? So they commute his sentence to life in prison. But think about it, if you're a 14-year-old and you're now sent to life in prison, that's the equivalent to a death sentence for you in terms of how you're feeling.
So by the time he's 15, he's still a youth, mind you, a convicted murderer. He spends the next 3 years at a training school for youth in Guelph. Then he turns 18, he's transferred to Collins Bay Maximum Security Prison in Kingston. That happens in January of 1963. His birthday was in January. By all accounts, he's a model prisoner.
The warden loves him. He lets him outside the gates to do farm work. Stephen will be befriended by the church pastor, the priest who's ministering to the prisoners. And that pastor will become his best friend after Stephen is finally let out of prison, will actually even marry him and his wife. So that's the kind of warmth that Stephen had and was able to win over these people. But while he's in prison, he's given LSD, which was used, they thought, as a truth serum. So that's the kind of horror he still had to live through. 10 years into his sentence, he will finally get parole.
One thing that I thought was interesting, well, a lot of things were interesting in your book, but one more piece from a political perspective, given where this case ended up as a miscarriage of justice. This is going back to when Stephen is in Guelph at the training school for youth, and Ontario's Minister for Reform, George Wardrope, visits and talks 45 minutes with Stephen and then publicly declares he has a great deal of doubt about Stephen's guilt. Well, you can imagine how that went over in the Ontario cabinet.
But it's interesting because, now I think we've proven, and his lawyers and especially his wife helped prove his innocence. But back then there was this debate. But it was significant enough. You had him, you had Isabelle Laborde's book, then you had the NDP raising it in opposition in the House of Commons. And the doubt over Stephen's guilt and the fact that Canada came this close to hanging him played a big role in the fact that Canada eventually, by 1976, abolished the death penalty. So it was because of that lingering doubt. And in that sense, Steven Truscott left us with an important legacy.
You just brought up Isabelle Laborde, who was a journalist.
Yep.
At a time when there weren't many women who were journalists, and certainly not investigative journalists.
Absolutely. She was a real pioneer.
She took on Steven Truscott's case because she went and looked at the court transcripts, everything that no one else had covered in the trial.
That's right.
But she couldn't get a publisher in North America. She had to go to the United Kingdom to write her book, which was questioning
It was called The
verdict.
Trial of Steven Truscott. I'm sure some of you would have read it when it came out. And what's amazing is she's such a pioneer. So no other journalist did what she did, which was to actually, let's go back and look at the transcripts. She didn't have what we had. She didn't have access to information. She didn't have the documents. She just had the transcripts. She questions it quite deliberately, quite provocatively. But again, it's hard to think what a different country. People were appalled that a journalist would dare to question the justice system. It just wasn't done back then. But also, she was a woman. I kid you not, one of the headlines at the time when she does her book tour was something like, widow challenges court decision, right? That's how they describe, like, the most important thing for the newspapers is that she was not even a woman, she was a widow. That shows how they demeaned the work that she was doing.
She's really the catalyst, her book,
Absolutely.
to give Stephen another chance at proving his innocence. The case goes to the Supreme Court of Canada.
That's right.
Where Stephen testifies.
He does. It's not a great testimony, you know. He's been in prison. He's nervous. Doesn't lie, but you know, he's just a nervous man who has spent a good part of his life in prison. What's shocking about the Supreme Court hearing is, again, most of it will turn on the so-called stomach evidence. They bring in world experts. Half of the world experts say, yep, Peniston was right, 7:15 to 7:45. The other half, and it was literally 50-50, said, absolutely not, that's garbage. We now know you cannot find a scientist today who would say that stomach evidence. I was working on a story recently where I asked a coroner, well, what does the stomach evidence tell us? And he says, it tells us what was in the stomach. What the last meal was. We know she didn't eat hot dogs. The last thing she ate was that, but it doesn't tell you anything definitive about time of death. Here's the shocking thing. Remember Dr. Peniston, he testifies, he writes up a typed autopsy report saying 7:15, 7:45. He now has doubts as it's going to the Supreme Court. He writes a memo called an agonizing reappraisal. Out of guilt, out of conscience, who knows? He writes to Harold Graham, who's now the head of the OPP. He was just a homicide cop who arrests Stephen. And he writes a long memo and he says, you know, I mean, probably because he was scared of the Supreme Court, I've been reanalyzing, and now I think rather than half an hour, it could be 12 hours or even 2 days, right? Well, that blows the case out of the water. What does Harold Graham do? Quashes that report. Never goes to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court of Canada has half the doctors saying one thing, half the other doctor saying the other thing. The Supreme Court never finds out that the doctor who actually looked at the stomach contents changed his mind. And the Supreme Court 8-1 votes to convict Stephen. The only person who thinks it's a horrible miscarriage of justice is Justice Emmett Hall, who gave us Medicare.
Stephen testified for 90 minutes.
Yeah.
It was a 4-day hearing. As you said, it was an 8-1 decision from the Supreme Court. Obviously, the whole situation took a toll on Stephen's parents, who separated shortly after
Yep.
the Supreme Court ruling.
Yeah, and again, think of, you know, it was a military family. He was, Lynne Harper was the daughter of an officer. There was quite a class system, as most of you could imagine. When the arrest and the trial takes place, the military, in its wisdom, moved the family hundreds of kilometers away to another base, so it was very hard to visit Stephen. It was a horrible, difficult time. They hope the Supreme Court will bring justice. The vote, of course, comes down 8-1. Stephen is crushed. Luckily, though, 4 years after, 1970, he's let out on parole after 10 years in jail, but he's still a convicted murderer, right? He's on parole. He's given an assumed name called Stephen Bowers, and he will move to Guelph, marry, as you'll see in the movie, a young woman named Marlene Bowers, who was very active in his campaign to free him. They will raise 3 lovely children, but he disappears, right? For 30 years, nobody knows who he is, where he's gone. He's hiding out in Guelph under an assumed name, one of the most popular guys in town. I remember interviewing the students, the friends of Stephen's kids, his 3 children, loved him. He was the most popular dad because he'd go out on the school ski trips and the other trips, and he was like the friendliest dad. And that's because he was reliving his childhood. He never had the teenage years and the high school years that they had. So he was a super popular guy, but nobody knew his real identity. I'd never heard from him, obviously, even though I'd seen his pictures in the 60s. until we get that phone call in 1997.
I want to talk about the three kids. There's a daughter and two sons. The
Yep.
daughter is the oldest. At some point, the Truscotts have to tell their kids the truth. But the daughter finds out before
That's
they
right.
get the
There were-
opportunity.
You know, think about it. If you're a dad, do you want to tell your children, oh, by the way, that's not my real name and I'm a convicted murderer? You know, I don't know. I have two kids. You know, there are a lot of things you might be a little worried about telling your kids. But Leslie is in high school, pulls out a book about the Truscott case, and it has pictures of the young Truscott. And right away she goes, oh my God, that's Dad. And you'll see the scene in the movie. It's pretty accurate. You know, she comes there, but she doesn't confront him. She thinks he's a hero. And one of the other kids, the Truscott case is brought up in class, and he goes up to the teacher and says, "I know you're talking about it. This case, you know, really like makes me uncomfortable." And the teacher says, "I know it's a graphic murder," and he said, "No, you don't understand. He's my father." So the kids rally around Steven. Steven never wanted to go public because he didn't want them to live through what he lived through, right? The divorce of his parents and all that horror and shame. And Marlene was the one who said, we have to go, we have to fight. And he said, why? I'm innocent in the eyes of my kids. We have a nice family. Why do we want to bring the public spotlight? But in 1997, once the kids were older, they reach out to the Fifth Estate.
You take that call, you find out about it, and you go and meet the Truscotts, and just pick it up from there. How does this, because that was quite a
when I
quite a
realized,
show.
okay, we're going to do the Steven Truscott story. I mean, for me, that was taking me back to my childhood. But we're journalists, right? We don't pick causes, right? And I've interviewed many people in jail. They all claim they're innocent. And again, the scene in the movie, I was actually on the set when they were filming that in Calgary, and it's pretty accurate, except I never had a mustache. And the actor's much handsomer than I was. But the rest of the scene is pretty accurate. So we come into their house, you know, we introduce ourselves, and, you know, we start talking. Okay, we can, you know, we'll try to do an investigation. But I say, as I always say, I said, Steven, I'm not here to defend you. I'm not here to prove you're innocent. We're journalists. We will go where the truth leads. And Steven says, I'm not worried. Dig up whatever you want. I don't have any fear about the truth. And that's the first time in my mind I said, this guy could be innocent, right? Because he's not frightened of the truth. I don't think any of us sitting in that room, me, my associate Teresa Burke, Marlene, and Steve, thought it would take 10 years. That was 1997. It wouldn't be until 2007. So a documentary, then we did a follow-up documentary. I did the book. There were like 4 or 5 editions of the book as the story kept changing. And it took a decade until Steven was finally ruled to have suffered a miscarriage of justice.
And the Fifth Estate piece aired on March 29th, 2000. 1.4 million Canadians watched.
Yeah, back then, people watched TV. TV is this thing people used to have.
Before the internet.
It's a little hard to
very
explain
close
what
to
it
it.
was for those of you who don't have white hair, but, you know, people watched TV back then.
It was called His Word Against History, the Steven Truscott story. It was interesting, you were telling me about, he worked in a manufacturing plant.
That's right.
And what happened when,
So think about
the
it,
morning
and
after?
you'll see a scene. The movie people, CBC never allows, for good reasons, its shows to be used in fiction movies because you don't know, how. But I convinced CBC. I said, no, I've looked at the script. So you'll actually see the real Lyndon McIntyre doing the show. You'll just see when he's interviewing, you'll see they obviously put the actors in, not the real Steven and Marlene. But there's a famous scene where you see Steven's face for the first time. When I was filming, I knew no one had seen him for 40 years. I knew it was going to be a key scene. We built it around 10 minutes into the movie, and I had Steven bicycle, the current Steven, right? He would have been about 50 back then. And we had him film, and we filmed it in black and white. Well, we filmed it in color, but the scene starts in black and white. You think it's the young boy, and then you see his face for the first time. Steven is still angry at me for that because it took 4 hours of filming, right? But people saw his face, and for the first time he becomes public. People in Guelph who knew him as Stephen Bowers, right? The friendly father of 3 kids. Steven, he works as a millwright, goes into the factory the next day, right? The factory just cheers him, right? He's a local hero. So he was worried about the publicity, but in the end it turned out quite well.
The Fifth Estate program leads to a federal government 690 appeal. And there are some folks from the legal community here that'll know what a 690 appeal is, but I suspect most don't, so tell us.
So if you've exhausted, Stephen went all the way to the Supreme Court. There's no other place you can go after the Supreme Court. But the government put in a clause in our criminal code that said after you've exhausted all your appeals, and you literally have to go as high up as you can go, you're allowed to write directly to the justice minister and ask him to reopen the case, and you have to be able to present the probability that you can bring new evidence. You can't say the judge was biased or I had a bad lawyer. You have to have new evidence. It's very hard to get the justice minister to agree. A very small percentage even get past the review. And then it's very hard if you get the 690 to win your case. So it took the lawyers, after the documentary comes out and after the book comes out, a team of lawyers, James Lockyer and Marlis Edward and Phil Carpenter, take on the case. And with Marlene's help and with our help, they start uncovering all the evidence that's in the book. And it just takes years and years and years for them to finally win.
And it's Mr. Justice Fred Kaufman who is assigned by the federal government to do the investigation. January of 2002, his report is issued 18 months later. In 2004, he interviewed 21 witnesses, including Truscott and including you.
Yep. So what happens is the justice minister said, all right, this is worthy at least for us to look into whether there should be a review. He gives it to Justice Kaufman. Justice Kaufman basically does another investigation. It's not a trial. And he determines that there is merit, right? That it should be reopened. Now, what does the justice minister do? Without getting into the legal technicalities, what Marlene and Steven wanted was a new trial. The justice minister would say, well, that was a bad trial, according to Kaufman. Let's have a new trial. You'll be found innocent and you'll walk away a free man. And you'll see in the movie that's not quite what happened. And it was a crushing moment for the Truscotts. Erwin Kotler, who I know quite well, and the Truscotts became quite friendly with him after, rules he won't give them a new trial. Instead, he'll send it to the Court of Appeal. But Erwin's logic was quite smart. He says, if there's a new trial, the prosecution, being prosecution, will say, well, Your Honor, a lot of witnesses are dead, it's hard to find evidence. We will stay the proceedings. All that means is you withdrawing the charge, but he won't be found innocent. So Kotler said, you'll always have that stain. If I send it to the Court of Appeal, the Court of Appeal can actually reverse the decision. And that, of course, is what happened. But it took 10 years.
It's also around the time where DNA evidence is becoming a much bigger deal, and you've got 3 men who are convicted of murder, and their convictions are overturned through DNA evidence. I'm talking about David Milgaard and Guy Paul Morin and Donald Marshall. The Truscotts were hopeful that DNA evidence would clear Steven Truscott's name completely.
Absolutely.
It led to the exhuming of the body of Lynne Harper.
That's right. There wasn't enough. I mean, think about it. If we had had DNA evidence back in 1959, they would have investigated Lynne's body and they would have been able to say definitively whether Steven did it or not. The Truscotts first asked for evidence. Was there old clothing, anything? All of it had been destroyed. It was an old settled case. Finally, much to the grief of the Lynne Harper family, they exhume her body, but there's not enough trace evidence to do DNA. So there was never any definitive DNA evidence.
The Ontario Court of Appeal issued a unanimous 5-judge decision to acquit Steven Truscott of the murder of Lynne Harper on August 28, 2007.
Yeah.
We use the word acquittal, but we don't have DNA evidence to prove
That's right.
not guilty.
And think, if any of you are charged with anything in a court of law and you win, you will be declared not guilty. You're not declared innocent. You're only innocent if they arrest the bad guy, if they arrest somebody else, but courts don't rule you innocent. I was sitting, that the decision is coming out. The journalists are in a lockup room, right? And we're looking at the report. Steven is looking at it with Marlene and their lawyers. So I know, and I'm racing through it and I'm going, oh my God, they have shut down everything. They denounced the police, the prosecutor, right? This is great. And then they have those ringing words, that he was a victim of a miscarriage of justice. Just to give you one taste of the evidence. Remember the time of death, 7:15 to 7:45? Then the agonizing reappraisal. Well, modern science, entomology, bugs, there were new scientific evidence that came forward, including the bug expert who testified at the original trial, who said, based on what we now know and the bugs that were growing in her stomach and in her body, she was probably killed sometime in the morning of the early mornings of Wednesday, or maybe even later. Again, proving conclusively that Steven could not have done it. So science, which was so badly used in 1959, helps acquit Steven in 2007.
We'll put up one more picture, a picture of you with Steven Truscott after
Yep.
you released the book.
Yep.
For the first time, this is a newspaper headline. A book could help clear Truscott's name.
Yep. I remember that day when he's cleared by the court, and you'll see the scene in the movie. I call my wife, who's also a journalist, and I say, "Hun, they've cleared Steven Truscott's name, right? This is the best day in my life." And then there's a pause, right? And I go, "Well, I mean, almost, right?" So, as a journalist, I've I've been to Afghanistan, I've been to Baghdad, I've put people in jail, I've gotten people out of jail, I've done stories on the Taliban, the Ku Klux Klan, biker gangs. You do your work as best you can, but no story obviously has moved me as much as Steven and Marlene's story. We remain friends. They don't do any more public speaking. I told them, of course, I was coming to Pembroke. They appeared at the movie premiere, but they, obviously thank you for your support. And I guess I'm not revealing any secrets in that they told me just a couple of days ago that they are now great-grandparents. They have the 3 kids, and then and there's a scene in the original documentary where Steven is holding his first grandchild, and I've seen them over the decades now, and they're doing very well, very happy, and you'll see a scene in the movie where the kids call him a hero, and it's just a lovely, caring family.
Let's close out talking about the movie as we set it up for what everyone is about to watch. How'd that happen?
So the book was, we do the documentary. I get a call from Random House saying, "Would you like to do a book?" And I say, "Sure. How hard can it do a book? I spent 2 years on the documentary." Little did I know, as Jamie, trust me, writing a book is hard. So we wrote the book, and then the book went through multiple editions as things start changing. And originally, the movie rights were bought, and a 4-hour, 2-part movie of the week was produced for CBC, who was pretty faithful to the book. CBC, in its wisdom, killed even though the script was written, by the way, written by the man who went on to write Handmaid's Tale for TV. Movie was killed, and then about 15 years later, I get approached by a Alberta producer, Wendy Hill-Trout, saying, "I'd like to option your book and make a movie." And I say, "Wendy, you're going to do a movie 20 years after my book was written about a case that was 40 years old when I wrote the book?" And she said, "Yeah, but I'm going to do it as a love story. I'm going to do it about a brave woman. And it's also," this was at the time Trump was coming up, "it's going to be about truth." So my book was an investigative book about a miscarriage of justice. Her movie, as you'll see, will be about a love story, one woman's drive, and the search for truth. It's amazingly accurate. Every character is real names. There's only one composite character who is Marlene's friend, and she's just a composite of various friends. It compresses 10 years into, an almost 2-hour movie. So obviously they have to simplify things. And as I said, I don't have never had a mustache. And there's also a scene when I've shown this in movie theaters, journalists laugh. There's a scene where you see me saying action. We don't say action when we're filming documentaries for CBC. But aside from that, it's a fairly accurate movie.
Julian, thank you for leading us through
you.
the Steven Truscott case and leading us into the movie called Marlene. Glad you finally made it to Pembroke. This is your first
glad.
visit.
I'll be able, I'm sure a lot of you have questions. I'd love to talk with you. So after the movie, we can eat more popcorn and talk. That's great.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Julian Sher, thank you.
Thank you.